Welcome to the 13th lecture of the MOOC course on sociological perspectives on modernity. In the last lecture, in the 12th lecture, we have started, we started with ultramodernism, the structuralist case or the structuralist interpretation of critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Okay. We are trying to examine the structuralist interpretation of critical modernist paradigm in sociology against the backdrop of those four central pillars of modernity, central philosophical and political foundations of modernity, namely holism or totality, reflexivity, rationality and social movements. I keep on repeating these things precisely because it will be easier for the listener, the learner to understand this. Okay. In the last class, if you look at this, in the last class, we discussed how structuralism or structuralist interpretation of modernity can be examined through the works of Levi-Strauss and Althusser. Okay. Differences between or distinctions between Levi-Strauss and Althusser can certainly be said to be critical in terms of their political positions, because Levi-Strauss was through and through a structural anthropologist, whereas Althusser was a neo-Marxist. But how structure always arises out of their works is very important to be examined. Okay. Then we have also discussed how the intersectionality between structuralism and structuralism on the one hand and positivism and functionalism on the other. Okay. Then when we started discussing structuralist interpretation of modernity through the lens of holism or totality, we have discussed how structure always or the proponents of structuralism always dwell upon the aspect of relationalism or the death of the subject or the death of the author. Okay. There we have discussed the distinction between Weber and Marx initially. Okay. For Marx, the relational emphasis derives from a conception of the individual as essentially social in nature, and for Weber, what is relevant to a critical species being is action, that is created towards the behavior of others. Okay. If you slightly recall the typology of social action, traditional social action, affective or emotive social action, value rational social action or goal rational social action, okay, goal oriented social action, which is alternatively known as instrumental rationality. Okay. And for Weber, value rational social action and goal rational social action, they contribute to the domain of meaningful social action. Okay. In both cases of Marx as well as Weber, structure arises out of social interaction geared particularly towards labor in Marx and towards meaning in Weber. Okay. When I say labor, okay, it emanates from a specific social and economic mode of production. Okay. When I say meaning in Weber, meaning which arises out of social action, okay, namely value rational social action and goal rational social action. However, in structuralism, what we have discussed, that relationship takes off and becomes fully independent. It is no longer human beings who relate with each other, but the fact of relationship which first creates the social and cultural individual out of an amorphous biological mass. Okay. That is why we have discussed, in structuralism, we can only know the social. In other words, the relational, and that the individual or human nature are therefore for structuralists are metaphysical concepts in the strict sense that we cannot know them. That is why I gave you this example that perhaps I do not know Lata Mangeshkar. As a person, I do not know Lata Mangeshkar, but I know through her performance, through her singing. Okay. It is only through their what all we have available to us is our social interaction with Lata Mangeshkar, for example. What she says and what she does, this is ultra relationalism. In other words, leads to what is known by the slogan of the death of the subject or death of the author. Okay? It implies that either the individual literally does not exist because the individual is only created by social interaction and forms simply an intersection between different social relations, or the individual is methodologically unknowable because we can only know the social. The individual is found in the world of unknowability, whereas the aspect of social can be found in the world of knowability, what we can know. Okay? Okay. The argument that the individual does not exist, that they are only the intersection of social relations or the bearers of social structure, is argued very strongly by Louis Althusser, who sees our belief that we are individuals to be a psychological illusion. What Althusser argues? Althusser argues that the category of all of the subject is the constitutive category of all ideology. That is what we have discussed already. That is why our illusory subjectivity generates ideology, and ideology reproduces our illusions of subjectivity. From difference, from relationalism and death of the subject or death of the author, we have also discussed difference. All that we can know or all that exists is the relational. If all that we can know about is relations, then we can think about the way in which those relations interact with one another in a very detached or often very formalistic approach. Okay? That's in this context we have revisited Weber's typology of social action. Okay? Then we have discussed what relationalism is likely to lead us to. In other words, is a categorization of different types of relation as well as different levels of relation, and an account of society in terms of the interaction of these different relations. This is very important. Not only types, but also levels of relation and how they interact with each other. So relational approaches tend towards this kind of categorization, but they also tend to privilege intellectual consistency over empirical usefulness. Okay? We have discussed this. As we generate more of these concepts describing types and levels of relations, we are going to want to make them as consistent as possible with each other for very valid intellectual reasons. For equally valid intellectual reasons, we are likely to want to be able to generate all of them from as restricted a number of basic concepts as possible. In other words, to generate typologies of possible variations and interrelations of particular types of relations. The net effect of all this, the entire gamut of structuralist accounts, accounts which derive all of social reality from the operation and permutation of a limited number of basic concepts. Okay? Because this core concept which our description of society is generated, okay, is a highly intellectual one. This is very likely to produce a form of philosophical idealism that we have discussed. I mean, what is philosophical idealism? It is a theory which treats the social world as generated from ideas, and in this case from a single idea. Okay? Unlike Marx and Weber. For Marx and Weber, our social world is a product of a multiplicity of ideas. Okay? For Weber, particularly for Weber. For Marx, it is not simply ideas, rather our social world is generated from not ideas but matter. Okay? We have discussed this in materialist conception of history, that matter is prior to the formation of ideas. Okay? But for structuralists, our social world is a product of only single idea. Okay? I mean, while there are dramatic differences in the content, the structure of our account of society is likely to be very similar whatever idea we start from. In some ways, Althusser's account that not of actual modes of production, but of the idea of modes of production, and Levi-Strauss's account of culture oriented around difference produce quite similar ways of thinking. Okay? I mean, that is how we have discussed how Levi-Strauss performs two operations in his account of human culture. I mean, on the one hand, Levi-Strauss employs a linguistic analogy to treat culture not merely as a system of relations, but as a system of symbolic relations, namely myths. Okay? And on the other hand, using the same linguistic analogy, Levi-Strauss aims at a purely formal description of the various elements involved in particular myths. In other words, Levi-Strauss sets out to describe structure, but not the content. Okay? Okay. Then where does the problem lie? I mean, what this leads to is an argument there is an objective meaning in human culture, which is different from the subjective meaning revealed by content. I mean, there is a difference between structure and content, and structuralists always try to look at the objective meaning in human culture revealed by structure, not the subjective meanings, subjective perceptions, okay, which are revealed by the content. Okay? What this objective meaning, I mean, which cannot be straightforwardly shown to be present in a particular myth or symbolic relation, once we bracket any question of the way people say they understand it or the contexts that they tell it in, it has to be located within the unconscious, because the content is removed from that. Only structure remains for the proponents of structuralists. In other words, I mean, from a description of social relations, we move to a description of the nature of human psyche. Okay? What Levi-Strauss claims to be the central feature of the human unconscious, a claim which he believes to be backed up by linguists, is naturally enough identical with the concept he uses to analyze the objective meaning of the form of myths. This concept is that of difference or distinction. For Levi-Strauss then, the end of the intellectual journey is a description of the social and in particular cultural world as a reflection of the supposed tendency of the human brain to divide things up. Okay? In this context, you see, we are still within holism or totality. In this context, two more components are going to be covered in today's lecture, that how I mean, both functionalism and modernity, okay, they can also be clubbed under, I mean, they can also be examined when we examine structuralist interpretation of modernity through the lens of holism or totality. Okay? Now, let us see what functionalism. What is that functionalism? Just to start with, what is functionalism in sociology? Functionalism refers to the idea of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. Okay? It may be caste, it may be race, it may be gender, whatever you look at, or it may be class also. Okay? In the social division of labor, functionalism always argues in favor of complementarity and reciprocity of roles. Okay? I mean, there is a problem with this approach. Suppose Marx said, how can how is social change possible? Marx said, social change is possible through conflicts, through class contradictions, and so on. For proponents of functionalism or structuralism, okay, no, social change is possible only through mutual cooperation. Okay? That is why the idea of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor was argued by the proponents of functionalism. I mean, there is a problem with this approach, and it is not just a difficulty with only Levi-Strauss. If we assume that the social world can be derived from an idea, and not only an idea, I mean a single idea, I mean that the idea of, suppose if I say the idea of not the actual mode of production, but the idea of the capital, the idea of mode of production. I mean, in this case, the idea of the capitalist mode of production, or the idea of difference. Okay? I mean, the idea of not actual mode of production, but the idea, I mean, not the actual mode of production, but the idea of mode of production, which was seen in the works of Althusser. I mean, the idea of difference or distinction is seen through the works of Levi-Strauss. Then in principle, there is no possible explanation of how social change arises. The world is divided up like this because it is identical with the wage in which that particular single idea is organized. There is no reason why it should not change. Okay? This is very important. Now, of course, one can develop ad hoc explanations of any changes in the structure, and in practice, this is very often done. These are very often done. I mean, when you look at this, if I say no, only through cooperation, mutual respect, and so on, we have been able to make social change possible or development possible. Okay, there is a problem. I mean, suppose how could Indians build a new social order against colonialism? It was not because of cooperation or mutual respect for each other, but it was only through conflicts. Conflicts in terms of classes, in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of nationality, and so on. Okay. I mean, the imposition of Western civilization on Indian population, the imposition of Western development or mainstream development paradigms on India's population, the imposition of slavery on India's population. Okay. That is why social change, that is why I said there is a problem with this approach, and it is not just a difficulty with Levi-Strauss. I mean, if we say that, if we assume that no social change has been made possible just because of such functionalist explanations, okay, I think there are certain problems. Okay. Then that is why I said the world is divided up like this because it is identical with the way the idea is organized and there is no reason why it should not change. Another one can develop ad hoc explanations of any changes in the structure, and in practice this is very often done. Another possibility is to develop a typology of different possible types of society, so that change is simply change from one way of expressing the idea to another one. A more interesting and widely used approach, however, is what is known as functional explanations. What are these then? If I say these are functional explanations, what do we mean by functional explanations? I mean, functional explanations are explanations of events, okay, not of their causes, but of their effects. What causes this? Okay, functionalists don't tend to explain. Functionalists always try to explain in terms of only effects. For example, we might explain the fall of a government. Suppose colonial government to Indian government, British colonial government to Indian government. A structuralist will not be explaining this in terms of events which led up to it, but where a functionalist will be more interested in, in terms of what it led to. That is why I repeat, for example, we might explain the fall of a government not in terms of the events which led up to, but in terms of what it led to. Okay? I can say that how Indians fought against the British. We must examine the nature of events, okay, that led up to an anti-colonial social and political movements in India, that led to such anti-colonial movements. But I just do not look at only this is only in terms of two events. This is colonialism and this is Indian government, British led colonial government as well, and then Indian political government, political state. Okay. That is why it is very important to look at any change in terms of the events which led up to it. There the proponents of functionalism committed a grave error, that they did not look at the social and political changes, economic changes in terms of the events which led up to it, but in terms of what it led to. On the face of it, this is simply unacceptable. The rules of logic do not, the rules of any substantive argument, okay, they do not allow us to reverse the flow of causality and say that an event A can be caused by an event B which has not yet happened. This form of explanation, which is known as teleological, can only make sense in one of two contexts. Okay? Teleological, I mean where I do not know what is the cause and what is the effect, I just know what is the effect. Okay? Let me give you a few more examples. One is in one of two contexts, when I say this kind of functional explanation which is known as teleological explanation can only make sense in one of two contexts. One is if event A is caused by a prior event alpha, for example, which is somebody's intention with regard to the future. We can certainly argue that a government fell because someone wanted to form a different government and thus forced the collapse of the current government. Okay? Okay. Nevertheless, intention and effect are two different things. I mean purpose and objective, I mean purpose and I mean intention when I say motive, okay, and effect, I mean desired result. Okay. They are two different things. The intention to bring about event B may not in fact be realized, and our action in causing event A may have completely different results. This is generally characterized as unintended consequences. It is a Weberian term. Okay. Unintended consequences are unanticipated consequences, and it is clear from Weber's account of goal oriented social action or instrumental rationality as a method we adapt as a means to a particular goal, but which then becomes an end in itself. So, an intentional or purposive explanation can only work where the person with the intention is in fact not just all powerful, but has total knowledge of the context of their action. In other words, where they are God. Much medieval thought is teleological in this sense. Events are explained in terms of God's plans or supernatural forces. Okay. That is why I mean for the future of the world. I mean that is what theological stage suggested, that social change occurs because of supernatural forces. Okay. This is very important. I mean that is why an intentional explanation can only work where the person with the intention is in fact not just all powerful, but has total knowledge of the context of their action. Okay. I mean in this sense all I mean medieval thought provided us provided such teleological or functional explanations in this sense. I mean events were always explained in terms of some supernatural forces for the future of the world. Okay. Apart from intentional explanations, there is one other form of potentially valid explanation in terms of effects, which is the argument known as functionalism. It is represented, for example, by the claim that such and such thing happens because the economy needs it, because of the interests of capital. And today the proponents of neoliberalism also do this, that no, our economy needs it, it is in the best interests of capital flows. Okay. Please note this, that this is quite different from an explanation in terms of the perceived needs of the economy as seen by the government, by the electors or by individual managers. It is also different from a simple explanation in terms of compatibility. Okay. I mean when I say compatibility, I mean by definition if a form of state is incompatible with a form of economic organization, they will not coexist. Okay. I mean the nature of the state must be designed in such a way that it must have some kind of compatibility with its economic, social and political organizations. But when I mention this, I do not I do not say anything about the reasons for their incompatibility or the mechanism which prevents their coexistence. Okay. I mean strict functionalist explanations are based on an analogy to Darwinian evolutionary theory. This argues in terms of competition for survival in a situation of relative scarcity, I mean principle of natural selection. Okay. The origin of species I am referring to, the evolution of species I am referring to. Okay. That is why we always try to argue in terms of, I mean when I say, I mean not we as such, but the proponents of functionalism, the proponents of the not simply Darwinian evolutionary theory, but the proponents of functionalist interpretation of Darwinian evolutionary theory, that which argues in terms of competition for survival in a situation of relative scarcity. Over immense periods of time, genetic mutations and variations will occur. Some of these will be functional for survival in the sense that they will either enable the new individual to survive more effectively or to breed more effectively. I mean, people very often say that why human species, though we are relatively physically weak as compared to a dinosaur, for example, why we didn't lose out. I mean, why we didn't cease to exist, or we haven't yet ceased to exist. Rather dinosaurs were such big, huge species, they were subject to extinction. Why? People attribute it to reasoning capacity. But Darwin made two very important remarks, scientific remarks, that one is adaptability. Okay, that the new individual, I mean, that which enables the new individual to survive. One is adaptability in a given topographic, geographic, cultural, natural environment. Okay. One, and secondly, the capacity for reproduction. Okay. The capacity to reproduce further generations. Okay. That's why to breed more effective. From the point of view of genetic reproduction, of course, what matters is that a plant or animal survives long enough to reproduce itself. The better its statistical chances of survival to this point, or the more successful it is at reproduction, the more individuals with this different genetic structure there will be. Over time, okay, putting it succinctly, over time, functional mutations will tend to reproduce themselves and spread. Less functional mutations will survive less frequently, given the competition for the same food and so on. I mean, principle of natural selection, and will be outclassed in terms of reproduction. Okay, that is very important. Okay, I mean, such argument doesn't hold good for social explanations, though. Okay, I said natural principle of natural selection. Okay, explanations were based on the basis of changes in nature, but this argument may not hold good for social explanations. I mean, explanations for social change, for three very important reasons. Firstly, it assumes fixed units such as individual animals. In other words, its natural affinity is with a radical methodological individualism, which takes the individual or some other unit, perhaps the family or the enterprise, not just as the starting point, but effectively as the only reality, which does not examine, for example, the social origins of the individual's ways of thinking and definition of needs, and which does not consider the possibility of interaction between, for example, the individual and the family. Okay. Secondly, it assumes that whatever the unit is, it has a means of self reproduction, which is as exact and as stable as genetic transmission. Obviously enough, however, even when forms copy successful forms, they do not reproduce all features of the successful forms, and they cannot. All they do is import what they perceive to be the important features. What I tell you, you do not copy me. What you tell me, I do not simply copy you. I perceive what is important for me. You perceive what is important for you, right? So, we can think of a general diffusion, for example, of instrumental rationality, which is intentional in nature, goal oriented social action. I mean, people think that it is likely to be effective, and it happens that they are right, but we cannot say that this is a functional process, rather an intentional process, purposive process. The continuing history of Anglo-American interest in Japanese management methods is an adequate example of this. Japanese management is not a single fixed entity like a collection of genes, but is transmitted as a series of what may be very differing assumptions about its key elements. Just as importantly, Anglo-American workers and managers and Japanese workers and managers have different cultural backgrounds. If our cultural backgrounds differ, then our strategies will differ, our management style will differ. So, that the assumption that the farm is a unit which is not influenced by other social realities false. Okay? The farm is also a social reality. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, okay, not only do we not have straightforward units, and not only can they not produce themselves in a simple fashion, but we have to say that the Darwinian argument of the survival of the fittest can only be a metaphoric one when it is applied to society. We could not live like that even if we felt it was desirable, that survival of the fittest. Okay? That the transmission, I mean the transition from changes in biology to changes in our economic culture and polity. Perhaps this such compatibility is not I mean such compatibility does not hold good, okay, does not stand the litmus test. This can be seen very clearly at the level of societies. I mean contemporary societies are not disputing a common living space. In fact, the economically dominant societies are experiencing a population decline. More generally, conflict between contemporary societies is only very rarely expansionist. Even where it is generally a matter of the imposition of a new form of government, but not of the obliteration of the previously existing society. Even where this is the case, as for example, in the population movements of the migration period around the fall of the Roman Empire, functionality is a fairly ambiguous concept. The societies which expanded into the declining Roman Empire, for example, were not in general technologically superior to the Romans, or even necessarily economically superior. Then what was that? In fact, their need to migrate may be seen as an evidence of the problems that they experienced in maintaining their way of life in the regions they originated from. Okay? Their superiority was partly demographic and partly military. In other words, functionality in these terms is almost entirely destructive and tells us very little about features of economic or social organization in the context of critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Then what about the structuralist interpretation of modernity itself? Okay? How does radical relationalism, I mean, I have discussed what we have discussed. We have discussed how radical relationalism leads to structuralism as a holistic account of society, and also indicate, okay, and also indicated the well-known difficulty that structuralism has with explaining change. Okay. The last feature of holism or totality that is worth mentioning here is the concept of modernity expressed in structure. Okay. I mean, this will be briefly, though, because while structuralism is strongly modernist in its approach, it does not treat modernity as a key term. It is itself modern, but it is not very interested in the specificity of the modern. There are obvious reasons for this. I mean, if society consists of a structure of relations deriving from a single key concept, single idea, okay, it is hard to see how we can have dramatically different types of society. Okay. That is why, though the proponents of structuralism or structuralism itself is a highly modernist approach, it does not treat modernity as a key term. It is in fact, it is itself modern, but it does not, I mean, it is not very much interested in the specificity of the elements which constitute the idea of being modern. Okay? Okay. That's very important. Okay. This is I mean, this is a problem for Levi-Strauss, who derives the organization of culture from the biological structure of the unconscious brain. In other words, from something which, if it changes at all, does so over enormously long periods of time. Not surprisingly though, Levi-Strauss's work, as was at the time the general practice among anthropologists, was largely devoted to the study of what were seen as traditional societies, and Levi-Strauss's concept of the modern is largely defined against this. Okay. To an extent, it appears that Levi-Strauss treats the modern as an aberration, an unnatural separation of culture and nature, and doomed to destruction for that reason. Okay? By bringing about a critique to modernity. I mean, what is so important about being modern for Levi-Strauss? No, it is not important. To some extent, he treats the modern as an aberration. It is a deviant from the way we conceptualize nature, individual nature as species being. It is not a natural separation. This separation between culture and nature is not naturally separated. I mean not naturally mediated. Rather, it is an unnatural separation of culture and nature, and hence doomed to destruction for that reason. That is why modernity cannot thrive. This may be appealing as a political position, but it does not really deal with the problem. And later structuralists have tried to show that modern culture can also be analyzed in the terms that Levi-Strauss uses for traditional culture. This is one part. On the other hand, Althusser, by contrast, fits modernity into a static typology, I mean unchanging typology, in which it is effectively simply one variant on a pattern. This derives from his version of Marxism, which replaces the crude version of economic determinism found in vulgar Marxism. Let me put it this way, that Marx never said this, I mean the crude distinction between economic and non-economic institutions. It is only when people try to misconstrue Marxism that people say that no, Marx said only economic considerations should be made, but it is not true. That is why I used this term that if everything is determined by economy, Marx never said this. Okay. Rather, Marx was trying more towards base and superstructure model, and there also his analysis of economic and other social institutions was more philosophical, okay, not economic as such. Okay. That the way he tried to treat political economy was a part of his philosophical investigations. Okay. The argument that everything else can, I mean when I say economic determinism, I mean everything else can simply be reduced to the economic considerations with a more sophisticated analysis of different levels of social life, including the economic, the political and the ideological. Each of these for Althusser can be described as relatively autonomous. In other words, it has a logic of its own and cannot simply be reduced to the economic. Okay. This is very important. I mean with a more sophisticated analysis of the way Althusser tried to do this. I mean it is very important to place economic, political, ideological and so on on equal parlance, okay, not on a higher pedestal vis-a-vis others. Okay. Okay. That is why it is very important. Okay. Okay. Thus Althusser's model of the social totality or social holism is that of a decentered whole, that nothing centers only on the economic, but political, ideological factors, they also shape our economy. Okay? That is why Althusser's model of the social reality is that of a decentered whole. Nevertheless, the economic is determinant in the last instance for Althusser. In other words, it has the final say. Since the last instance for Althusser, what is that last instance? No, last instance never comes. Only we have this idea about the last instance. The way he said, there is nothing called actual mode of production, but the idea of mode of production. Okay? That is why since the last instance never comes, though it is the interaction between the economic, political and ideological which is most important. Incidentally, this tension between determination in the last instance and the insistence that the last instance never comes is one of the major theoretical problems of Althusser's holism or totality. Determination by the economic level expresses itself primarily in the creation of these separate levels and the prioritizing of one or the other at different historical periods. In other words, within a given mode of production, it is the economic level which determines which level is dominant in a more immediate sense. Okay. For example, in feudalism, the political and ideological levels are dominant. In capitalism, it is the economic level which is economic level itself which is dominant. In both cases, however, the economic level is ultimately determinant. In other words, it determines whether it will itself be dominant or whether some other level will be. It is the economic which is going to determine. This makes, I mean, what does it refer to? This makes a certain kind of sense. I mean, the economic for our purpose, for these purposes can be thought of in terms of the relations of ownership and control. In feudalism, the landlord owns the land, but the peasant controls their agricultural production. So, the appropriation of the peasant's surplus production by the nobility does not take place within the actual process of production, but as an effect of political or ideological structures which guarantee this transfer. On the contrary, in capitalism, the means of production are both owned and controlled by the capitalist. Thus, the appropriation of surplus value takes place within the process of production. The society is therefore said to be dominated by the economy. For Althusser, in other words, the difference between modern and other societies is that that they represent different possible arrangements of the ownership and control situation. In this way, structuralism is unable to do anything very interesting with the idea of modernity or indeed of social change more generally. It tends to reduce history either to contingent change without any real meaning or to variations on a theme. That is why there is you will find the absence of content, only structure is becoming more important. Okay. In this lecture, in the last, in the 12th and the 13th lectures, in these two lectures, we have covered the structuralist interpretation of critical modernist paradigm against the framework of holism or totality. Okay. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss structuralist interpretation of modernity through the lens of, to start with, social movements, rationality, I mean, when I say social movements, I mean ideology and function, political background. I mean, what kind of, there is no one Marxism, but there are I mean, in the structuralist case there are two Marxisms, okay, okay, but there are multiple Marxisms that we see today. Okay. Then we will also see, I mean, under social movements we will see ideology and function and the two Marxisms, I mean the political background. In rationality we are going to discuss the meaning of science. In reflexivity we will discuss Levi-Strauss's uncertainty principle. I mean, in the next lecture we are going to cover. Okay. Thank you.